are really delighted to welcome everyone to this Media Education Lab webinar. The title of this webinar is Propaganda Everywhere, Teaching Propaganda Across the Disciplines. And today we're going to spend the next 60 minutes in a rich dialogue with 4 faculty who have been thinking about how to teach about propaganda. And so we're going to move through a process that will look something like this. We're going to ask the faculty to introduce themselves briefly by talking about what they love most about teaching propaganda. What is the biggest challenge that you face? How do you organize your course and why have you organized it that way? And what is one assignment that you find most valuable for your students? In about a half an hour, after we've talked for a little while, we're going to break up into some small groups and we're going to hear from the participants how you are teaching about propaganda, what you are thinking about in terms of this topic as it relates to your discipline or your research area or your teaching interest. And then we'll come back for the last 10 minutes and we'll make some reflections and observations and discoveries as we think about the pedagogy of teaching propaganda in an interdisciplinary context. But before we do this, in the spirit of the villainous reputation that propaganda has, I would like you to use your annotation tool, or you can open up the chat room. And right now, if you're feeling a little villainous, which of these Disney villains feels like you today? Which one captures a little bit of your mood or spirit today? Feel free to use the chat room, or if you like, you can use the annotation tool. I am feeling very much like, well, let's be honest, like the evil queen in Snow White. So you see how I have annotated using the annotation tool. I'm feeling a little bit like I'm offering a little bit of a gift, but oh, it might be dangerous. Who's next? Annotate the chart and introduce yourself. Which of these villains do you identify with today?
I can't find the tool.
Oh yes, roll your cursor up to the top of the Zoom page, and then you're going to see something that says something like
Speaker view,
share,
view options.
View options, click view options, and then you'll see a little pencil, and that's the annotate tool. All right, so play with the annotate
go next.
tool. Thank you. Go ahead.
As the Scandinavianist in the group, I should probably go with Little Mermaid and Ursula here.
Makes perfect sense. Very nice. That fairy tale's been around in Scandinavia for what, millennia, right?
About 200 years, yeah.
Nice. Thanks for sharing. Who's next?
I'll go, and I have to confess right away, as someone who teaches propaganda, I'm so unfamiliar with most Disney characters, so I'm going to pick somewhat randomly. I'm drawn to this Tiger King figure right there. Probably not known as the Tiger King, but
he's got a crown.
Yes.
Yes, he looks a little villainous. Like, I think that is Richard II, maybe, or Richard III in some remake. Thanks for sharing. Who's next?
I'll go. I'm an Alice in Wonderland fan, and think of propaganda as the Red Queen effect. You have to run faster just to stay in place to do it, and all of its profusion of creating a world in which you rule.
Nice.
The Red Queen effect.
Nice. And there she is. All right, we'll hear from our participants now. Which of these characters feels like you're feeling at your most villainous propaganda best? Catherine, tell us more.
Hello. Hello, everyone. I just
Hi,
said I'm
Catherine.
going with Gerald. I liked your idea.
Oh, thank you.
Sometimes I want to shout at my worst, off with their heads, off with their heads.
Yes, yes, one solution operation.
I see a Simba. Somebody has circled Simba down there at the bottom. Or not, is that Simba or the other guy? Tell us more.
But yeah, that's mi alma. I thought that it was kind of being furious about things and maybe about propaganda, bad propaganda. So that's the way I feel.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing. Anybody else? Introduce yourself to us and tell us a little bit about the icon, the avatar that you picked. I see Salome on the call. Salome, can I call on you? Marilyn, can I call on you? I love using cold call in a Zoom meeting. I see somebody has circled Cruella DeVille in pink up at the top there. Do you see? Cruella DeVille. Who circled Cruella DeVille?
That's me. That's me. How are you? It's
Hi.
Karen Davis. I haven't joined you for a while. Haven't seen you since the summer. But definitely, when I saw Cruella, I definitely felt like Cruella for two reasons. One, I just generally love Cruella. But the second is I had a class with a bunch of middle schoolers who drove me insane today. And I found that my use of language was probably not appropriate to my middle schoolers who, and I didn't like myself for that. So Cruella fits.
It's okay if you're feeling Cruella every once in a while. Thank you so much for sharing. Now I'm going to invite us to hear from our, hold on just a second, to hear from our speakers. We're just going to go round the table, as it were. What do you love most about teaching propaganda? Tony?
I would say what I love most is when we're talking about polarization, the ways in which political polarization and identity polarization affects people's conceptions of truth and how they go about seeking truth. And honestly, it's really just discussing that topic, because I find the discussions about that topic some of the most rich. My students bring in their own experiences and are highly engaged. It's a topic, it's both a personal interest, but I think it's also just a topic that engages some of the most enriching discussions really quickly.
Great point. Tom, what do you love most about teaching propaganda?
I really like introducing students to the cultural stories. I teach propaganda. The first half is the beginning part of the 20th century, taking a historical point of view. And then the second part is leading up to propaganda in a digital age, where the whole apparatus is on the table and undefined, and getting students to imagine for their generation where propaganda sits at the present time.
Great point. Making that connection between the past and the present is a thrill. Glenn, what do you love most about teaching propaganda?
You know, as a historian, we're looking at previous countries or previous times, and I love when students are seeing the connection between the historical and methodology and approaches and themes from the present era as well, and are able to make those connections. But also for me, we think of propaganda and we think of Nazi Germany, we think of the Soviet Union, and I like to emphasize that every state is using propaganda, that it's around us in so many different ways, and it's not just Nazi Germany and Soviet Union and other totalitarian regimes.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things I like best about teaching propaganda. I love exploding some misconceptions that my students have, that propaganda is only used for nefarious purposes. And so the fun of coming in and showing them a public service announcement and saying, well, you know, according to the definition of propaganda we just talked about, this is that, right? I love thinking about propaganda in relation to activism and social change, because students have in their heads that propaganda is everything they dislike. And it's a surprise to discover that, in fact, there's so much of culture being disseminated via propaganda that they really, really love. And I just have to say, another thing I really, really love is I love the idea of having them navigate through a process where they have to find a way to come out on the other side of skepticism. Right? The class can't end with nihilism, right? So it's sort of like
Hopefully.
hopefully watching it come out on the other side, and they start to feel like enthusiastic and optimistic, and they start to see that propaganda is a mechanism for making things better too, right? So that's something I really love. All right, so let's go to our next question. This is a question about the challenges that you have faced when teaching propaganda. What's the biggest challenge, or what are some of the most interesting challenges you faced when teaching propaganda?
I'll say, I think you just alluded to what I first think of with this question, and that is getting over that hump of a sort of nihilistic skepticism. Especially, I mean, I think it's especially tempting to see everything you're not predisposed to have good feelings towards, or any political source or news source, corporate source for that matter, that you don't have pre-existing good feelings, as this evil propagandistic source, and not to use some of the same criteria to think about you know, things that students already come in with more positively predisposed to. So I think it's getting over the skepticism, and of the skepticism of just any kind of institutional authority equals bad, and propaganda education can maybe help us see that more clearly. Might sometimes that initial response, or a response along the way.
Thanks for sharing. Tom, Glenn?
Yeah, the show propaganda pathways into culture, into cartoons, art, music, and the hardest thing I have to do is to get students to focus on an object, on a thing, on an event, and to not conclude why they feel a certain way, but to look at it and see what it's doing, or what it did for other people, and what it can do. Students are thought to think very quickly and arrive at conclusions, and it's hard to slow them down and have them look at a text or a shape or a color, or figure out what a resonance is between a couple of different objects. So that's a hard thing, just getting them to look at what there is there. Listening to Louis Armstrong smile, for example, is something that you can see a kind of optimism being born that's controversial, because sometimes Armstrong is viewed as complying, and other times he's viewed as a kind of deep resistance. And so having them come upon something that matters, how they take it in or read it or animate it in their mind, is a challenge for me. And I enjoy the challenge, but it is something I note about generation after generation of students.
Thanks for sharing. Glenn?
And I want my course to be global and kind of the arc of the 20th and into the 21st century, and finding readings that I can have students do that are really delving into different regions of the world with an analytical approach focusing on propaganda is one of the challenges that I have. There are some great readings certainly about the United States, about Nazi Germany, about the Soviet Union, some perhaps about the British, but not as much about Latin America, not as much about North Korea, or China. Yeah, so it's finding those critical readings about propaganda and not necessarily about, okay, this is the society. And so trying to blend that so that I can show examples of propaganda and we have a base to analysis that is connected with the cultures and their history. That's been the challenge for me.
Mm. That is fascinating. I'll just make a tiny little pivot to say one of the biggest challenges that I face. I think I face many challenges, so maybe that's a big topic for me. But one challenge I face is that I'm frustrated by the kind of materials and resources that I have access to. Of course, I came of age during the very famous documentary, The Manufacture of Consent, right? The huge inquiry, Noam Chomsky's follow him around the country giving his speech and kind of unpack. I cut my teeth on that, but I can't use it anymore. And I don't actually want to use it anymore, right? I now see it as propaganda. In fact, I see that a lot of documentaries about propaganda are pushing an ideology that I really want to problematize. And when I show a documentary, the authority of showing a documentary to my students is that they take it as God's truth, right? And it's very, very challenging to get them to talk back to it. The most success I have had at students talking back is showing the German comedy, Look Who's Back, which is a comedy film about what would happen if Hitler came back. And somehow, because it's entertainment, it's approachable and students can push back against it. They can wrestle with it. They can look at the way the filmmakers' ideologies are present in the film. But documentaries, my students have been trained that they're truth, and that it's kind of, in just 14 weeks, kind of hard to push them off that topic. So that's one of the challenges that I face. The other challenge, go ahead.
Oh, The Death of Stalin would be an interesting, interesting film for the students.
Yeah, has anybody used that in your teaching?
No.
Yeah, that would be intriguing to figure out how to do it. I think I also face a challenge in getting my students to create propaganda. I don't know if any of you have tried to do that. I've tried and failed a million different ways. And I keep trying, because I do think it's important to think about what you can learn about propaganda, and especially in the ethical conundrums of the propagandist, by being a propagandist yourself. Glenn, you had your students make propaganda, didn't you? Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, and that was actually one of your next questions about the assignment that we like the most, is actually having them create a campaign, a propaganda campaign. And both times I've had students do this, it was they decided as a class to be one single group instead of creating multiple different campaigns. I teach the course typically every other year, and so they tend to be big election years. And so the first year that I did this, they had a get out the vote propaganda campaign that they did, and they tied it specifically to our campus community. So they booked the campus mascot and did a photo shoot one afternoon in all different locations around campus, and then created posters. They created a video that was shown at the movie night. So they really seemed to get involved in that.
And so just to put a hard edge on it, why did you think that was a good assignment?
I wanted them to get the experience of creating a campaign where it's not necessarily a single image, but to see how propaganda, the same message, can be distributed in different ways. And so they had to have two different components. So they couldn't just do a series of posters. They had to do perhaps social media and posters, or a commercial and something else. They had to find out what they wanted to do. And I thought that hands-on approach would give them different insights. They were then supposed to do a reflection as to how effective their campaign was. And that was the part that they've always struggled with, to get that response back from what worked or what didn't work, or how they might modify it if they were to do it again.
Nice, thanks for sharing. Tony, what's one assignment that you find most valuable for your students, and why?
Well, one assignment I've used in the past, unfortunately, because there's some downsides to this that I can mention, I will not use it this time, but I found it really valuable is I teach mine sort of like a sociology, media sociology class, and they write a final paper. But in the past, I've asked them to, in addition to their final paper, create like a movie trailer to hype the controversy. So, you know, they have to think in the sort of propagandistic modes of hype. And, you know, so the benefits are, one is actually, I think it actually helps students get more excited about their own research project because the hype is convincing to them, if no one else at least. And it also, you know, obviously there's a practice element of really thinking about how to do propaganda as you're working on that part of the assignment. The challenge is the video skills and trying to find ways to negotiate teaching video skills. And I mean, not only video skills, but honestly, just the various different forms of like video capture and people using different devices. It can bog things down. And because I'm teaching remotely this semester, I threw my hands in the air. I was like, I can make it an optional thing, but I know a lot of my students actually don't come in with the abilities to do that very easily. So they won't be able to.
Cool. Thanks for sharing. Tom.
One of the areas of my study is getting students aware of EU and Scandinavian approaches to communication, which are quite different than the United States, and then having them do reports on that. Teaching online, one of the strategies I've used is ask students to keep a journal and to make sure they understand the journal. And the first part is to get down concepts, and then the second part are events, and the second part to explore more contemporary. My course is on propaganda, ideology, and public controversy. And so part of what I do with the journal is get them to write down basic ingredients of ideologies. And I use a British collection of studies on ideology to distance themselves from being seeped in American culture. So I'm trying to smuggle in a different point of view without going post-colonial on them.
Huh, fascinating. So I'll share one assignment that that I'm doing right now. Students have to identify an example of harmful propaganda, and they have to make a 3-minute video about that artifact and why they think it's harmful. And what I am learning, and we post that to our class. We have a class page on Medium, right? So they post that and some reflective writing about the learning experience to the class blog on Medium. What I am discovering, since I'm in the middle of that assignment right now, is that you know, I can't make any assumptions about what my students have learned before I get them, right? So,
Yes.
and what I am learning right now is that I didn't teach them about quality news sources. I didn't. I assumed they were seniors in college. They had understood that. And as I asked them to go find me an example of a news story that is addressing how the social media platforms are making efforts to limit exposure to harmful propaganda. That's like every day, every newspaper, they put that up on a shared Google slide and they make an interpretation. They offer their, 2 or 3 paragraphs on one Google slide so I can see everybody's work product all at once. And I can see that while, yes, I've got kids who are quoting from the New Yorker and the New York Times and the Guardian and, mainstream media, I also have kids who are quoting from very strange websites that I've never seen before, which then puts me in the situation of going down the rabbit hole to figure out what are these sites. And often they're marketing websites that have rewritten a piece of news, like from the BBC. They've rewritten it in that snappy, sassy 20-something voice, right? And it's like, I can't blame the kid for thinking of that as news. And it is sort of, right? But it's being disseminated by a marketing firm, right? Which is so elegantly like, ooh, and just really what I'm trying to teach them about, that I feel like, I think this assignment will get better as I do it more. I'm learning. I guess I'm not sure it's the best assignment yet, but I feel like I'm learning about how it layers in to a bunch of different competencies, right? And being able to form value judgments about what you think is harmful propaganda and why, because a big part of my course is to recognize that the interpretation of propaganda is situational and contextual, and you make the value judgment about benefits or harms, right? You do, you make that benefit. So I guess now it's time for us to turn to this question of how is your course organized, and what are the frameworks and the underlying organizational structure, and maybe even the stance you take, the ideological stance you take. So the question really is just that simple. How do you organize your course? Why have you organized it that way? Glenn?
Yeah, so I take an approach. I have the first couple weeks of the class focused on what is propaganda, kind of the analytical approach. We use Bernays' crystallizing public opinion, which still so resonates. So we use that as the framework. And then in subsequent weeks, I take a different event, like the First World War, or I might take a different state and focus on examples and readings, and we delve into that. Each week then, with those themes, students have to find an example of propaganda from that topic or from that state, and do an analysis of it, and how the propaganda reflects the values of the state at the time, what the message is, whether or not perhaps it would be effective. And then for a midterm, and again for the final, they have to take a couple examples of propaganda and bring them together and analyze them. And typically I have students working on a web page, and so they're all contributing their projects all along. And so for those analysis papers, they have to take the propaganda that either they have done themselves or a classmate has done, or a previous iteration of the course, and find what are common themes, what are kind of common elements, and across states as well. And so it can't all be, oh, the Soviet Union always has this dominant theme present, but seeing, okay, so this thing that the Soviet Union is doing was quite similar to what the US was doing as well. So that type of analytical approach.
Really building their comparative and cross-cultural understandings. Fascinating.
Absolutely.
Tony, how do you organize your course, and what's it built on?
Mine is certainly much more American-centered, and I start at a similar place with debates about what is pop propaganda, reading some like different theories, different definitions, Caroline Jack's Lexicon of Lies, and a little bit of Gillette and O'Donnell's book on propaganda. And then we sort of focus, we looked at the early half of the American 20th century, then bring it up to some more recent debates. But then I actually, the sort of middle of the course looks at different sort of social conditions that contribute to the power of propaganda, or at least to anxieties around propaganda. So we look at sort of ethnic, racial division, religious division, political polarization, technological change, and battles over media policy. And then at the very end, we turn towards sort of what are the big idea solutions, and usually more like society level solutions of what are the proposals for policy interventions or corporate interventions, certainly in terms of talking about a lot of social media companies. But yeah, so it's big ideas, particular social factors, and then sort of what is to be done section.
Cool. Thanks for sharing. Tom?
Thank you. I start out the first couple of weeks talking about the history of war and peace and what are cycles of war and peace, offense and defense, and how these cycles resulted in the sort of great transformation of the 19th century with peace and communications evolving to bleed off conflict through colonialization. Uh, and so I create a bigger framework within which to think about ideologies. And then during the first half, we go through different historical moments, World War I, the 20s, the rise of fascism. I'm big on Mussolini and totalitarianism with Nazi. And then I look for a bit at the internationalist movements following on the Second World War, because I think that's where the structures of Cold War as a discourse formation, where propaganda within game theory becomes the opposite of what it was, or becomes inverted in a lot of ways. Then the second part of the course, I keep changing a bit. I look at some anxieties as essentially propaganda bleeds over into public relations, and American politics becomes go as low as you can with no bottom line, none. Essentially, there's no ethic built into public relations or media, and without any guardrails. And the legal guardrails are really bizarrely constructed off false metaphors of analog media. So the second part of the semester, it really depends on topics. The use of social science in distortion of public communication. I would like to take them through Husserl's Crisis of the Humanities, but we just kind of stick with Yossi Benkler and the Harvard Research Group on network society. One of the things I've found in 2020, there are huge numbers of popular books coming out on disinformation, misinformation, and what to do about democracy. And I haven't seen Crisis of Democracy books since the 1930s to this extent. So the stakes are, you know, as we all know, next week and this week, the stakes are huge.
Right, right. It's really the case. I love the point, Tom, that we've seen just a proliferation of popular books about this topic, but the teachers that I work with in elementary school and middle schools and high schools and even colleges and universities have some anxieties about teaching this topic because of the way that polarization has made it challenging for teachers. So I'm going to share my screen with you and walk you through the way I approach it. I'm always sensitive. I'm teaching undergraduates in a communication program, but I bring my interest in pedagogy into the equation. So we start with history, and we read Eddie Bernay's Propaganda, 1928, and we look at the Great War, right? And we read about the Institute for Propaganda Analysis, right? The Media Literacy Initiative from the 1930s and early 40s. Then we go into Shoshana Zuboff and the surveillance capitalism, and we understand the economics of how propaganda now spreads peer-to-peer, and we learn about virality. We recognize that it's no longer just someone else, the government or the capitalists who are pushing propaganda, that it's happening peer-to-peer in our networks. Then we turn to journalism and public relations, election propaganda, and the dark side. And this is a really nice arc that really starts with Chomsky-Herman, the idea that journalism is propaganda, moves into election propaganda as a part of the democratic process, right? The idea that propaganda is necessary for democracy and that people make decisions about elections based on feelings, and that's not a bad thing. Feelings are information, right? And then the dark side of propaganda, which is about lying. lying and hate speech, and a big thing about hate speech there. Then 3 weeks on kind of going from darkness into light, right? Conspiracy theories. And this week, my students get to choose one of 3 conspiracy theories: Holocaust denial, QAnon, or COVID vaccines, right? We spend a week on terrorism as propaganda, and we start to understand that terrorism has often been called the propaganda of the deed, right? We understand why public actions, violent actions, are used by people to shape discourse. And then we talk about Banksy, right? We talk about Banksy, right? So, and then we broaden the net in the last part of the course to understand patriotism and nationalism as constructs that are used to induce people to act together to build consensus in democracies. We unpack the textbook wars in education as propaganda has been used to make history, to change shape the way we think about history, and also monuments. We talk about that then. And then we go full on crazy on military propaganda in American military movies, war movies, essentially. So I think I would say that I would describe the approach that I use as eclectic, as rooted in this practice of building connections between people's lived experience. Like, my students have lived experience with textbook propaganda. They have lived experience with first-person shooter games that make war look cool. They have lived experience with a lot of different kinds of propaganda, and the goal is to get them to take their lived experience and get some critical distance from it and understand it in a larger context, right? And put some theoretical frames around them that helps them make sense or have an aha experience.
See it as propaganda.
And then I have to pull back the curtain and say that, yes, I've designed the course, right, as propaganda about propaganda. And that gets very meta, but it's okay. So here's what we're going to do next. If it's okay with you, we're going to break up into a couple of small groups. We're going to get to meet those of you who've joined us. We're so glad. 19 of you are on this call. And so we'll have some conversations. We'd like you to tell your stories. Why is it important to teach about propaganda? What do you love about it? What are you afraid of? Right? What's worked for you? What are some challenges? Give me a thumbs up if you understand what we're going to be doing in these small group breakout rooms. Right? So thumbs up, show me your thumbs. Yep. I am going to break us into 3 breakout rooms. We'll take about 12 minutes to do this. See you in a bit. Open up the rooms, Renee, and join the room for a discussion. Make sure you introduce yourself to the person you're chatting with.
These weekly mass recoveries, if this to mitigate panic, or does this have some political motives? Like, for example, like I think 2 years later we will have our presidential election. So does this factor in with that? Does this also factor in with, let's say, political pride, since our president is kind of wacky in terms of keeping his macho image? He wants to portray this image that, hey, I am the one who vanquishes everything from drugs, from criminality, and right now COVID-19. So there are lots of angles where we can analyze why this data doctoring is happening. So that's what I'm trying to do right now with my class.
So cool.
Fascinating.
So
Thank
Karen,
you for that.
that was absolutely fascinating. So Karen, tell us about your experience teaching propaganda.
Well, I'm not teaching in college. You might remember I teach middle school and upper. Actually, I teach pre-K through 12, and I get a chance in all levels to do it somehow. So I would say my biggest challenge, and I guess you sort of alluded to this, Renee, a little bit. My biggest challenge is that they they believe all the stuff they're seeing. So when we talk about propaganda, they already assume that all news is propaganda. So I spend a lot of time with them, really having them look at what makes news versus, and what is journalism, what are the ethics in journalism that really do apply to news, and what is propaganda. And I don't, who just mentioned it, if they're seeing something that is actually sponsored, that is propaganda, and it's not news. Now, it's made to look like news, but it's not. So I start with that. But that's probably, for me, the biggest thing is that we spend a lot of time really going through what does fake mean. It's sort of in the same context as what does like mean. Those two words are completely different than the normal, there's no normal, than the meanings when I grew up, when most of us grew up 10 years ago. Anyone who is not currently in in school, for any of us.
Such a great point about how those words are transformed. And part of what you have to do is help kids have some devices for sorting out what they are. Dr. Yale, yeah, Dr. Yale, tell us about what do you love and hate about teaching propaganda? Have you had the experience of teaching propaganda? What do you do?
First of all, it's an honor to be with you. Absolutely. But secondly, I wanted to say that I'm very sorry I had to get off the other group because my battery on my computer is not working. So I just joined through my phone, and here as I am. I just wanted to say I've been teaching, actually speaking to groups of retirement homes for the past 17 years on different topics. My dissertation was media literacy for senior citizens, 2020, age 65 and up. And this is the group that I deal with. I've been actually writing to you about it, but let's not talk about it now because I don't want to take too long of your time. But I've been teaching them propaganda, as believe it or not, many people of this group are familiar with propaganda. They lived through the European bad times and atrocities, and they can tell me about propaganda. And what I do with them, I ask them to bring examples, to go online and bring to the lessons a lot of examples of propaganda. And I tell you, I learn from them more than they do from me.
That is a great pedagogy right there. That is a great pedagogy right there. Ask your students to bring you examples of what they think is propaganda. I do that with when we do our sponsored, can you recognize sponsored content on your social media feed? It's shocking and powerful to see what they actually get exposed to. Now, Salome, I want to turn to you. How do you experience, why do you teach about propaganda? What does it mean to you, and what are some strategies that you are experimenting with?
Thank you, Renee. First of all, Dr. Yale, I think we need to connect because I'm very much interested in adult media literacy, not ages above 65, but mostly like parents and teachers. So this is something very interesting to me, and we need to talk more later.
I would love to.
Thank you. Speaking of propaganda, I'm not a teacher. I'm not teaching at this moment, but I think I was thinking, while you were discussing and responding this question, I was imagining if I was a teacher and I had to write a syllabus or some kind of agenda for teaching. To me, propaganda is appealing in terms of like a positive propaganda. So when people assume that something that propaganda is fighting for, or something that propaganda is trying to critique, I think there is a very interesting point to start observation or research. So to make it more understandable for everyone, what I was trying to say, there are some ideas that are considered like a positive ideology. So I would love to understand what's behind these positive ideologies. And what's the power of this positive power of propaganda.
It is ironic that propaganda, it can be used for good or evil, and it's a disruptive idea for us to think about that. It's a troubling idea because we're so used
Well,
to
I like using, I said this in the other chat, I'd like showing them Arab Spring, and I like, you know, to me, that's a great example. But although now my students are too young, they don't even know what Arab Spring is, and that's like, oh my God. So, so I have.
Thank you for talking about it. Thank you so much. You are giving me an idea. Thank you. Thank you.
No, that's good. I mean, I'm using TikTok now in this class that I'm doing. TikTok during COVID, and how that has changed society, or vice versa, you know. Wow. That they can really, and that they really get, because they.
Okay, I disrupted you by bringing you all back to the room together. Thank you so much for coming back. We have about 9 minutes remaining, and I bet some interesting ideas kind of bubbled up in your small group. So why don't we just try to identify the most fertile of the ideas that came up in our small groups? Who wants to go first?
I can start. So really emphasizing for people of all different age groups, whether from senior citizens to middle school, we had represented in our group, recognizing that propaganda isn't something relegated to the 1940s, but is still very relevant to today, and understanding that, and understanding the connection with disinformation as well.
One topic that came up in our group, a Juven from the Philippines, a new young teacher teaching propaganda for the first time. And guess what he's doing? He's using the way the government is presenting COVID data, and he's looking at data as propaganda, right? And I think that is a mind-blowing and creative way to get students to appreciate the carefully constructed narratives that rely on data, that use data, right, for a certain political point of view. And he says what he tries to do is he gets them to simply wonder, why was it created? Why is it categorized? Why are people immediately recovered? As soon as they are recovered, they're immediately 100% healthy in the way the government categorizes. And what might be the political benefit to Duterte wanting to show these charts and graphs that look like he was responsible for the Filipinos' recovery in COVID? That was fascinating to me. Data as propaganda, I feel like I don't do enough about that. I want to do more about that next semester. What other ideas came out of your small group discussion that were fertile, interesting, or provocative? Just unmute your microphone.
One of the things that we grappled with was something that you had started to talk about right before the breakup group, which is trying to help, the question, I guess, of how heavy-handed to be in identifying sort of quality, or especially for news sources that follow professional practices. And that I think Catherine was saying that, talking about a list of independent media sources. And for a long time, I think for many of us, and I'll certainly admit for me, independent media was often kind of code for sort of like progressive media. And that is certainly not the case for a lot of students right now. And so I think just grappling with these questions of you know, it's one thing in propaganda courses where you can maybe take time to talk about what professional practices are, sort of, you know, critiques of them, their advantages, etc. But in so many classes, you know, you can't do that every class. And so how do you, what kind of advice to give to students about quality and news sources was something we grappled with.
Thanks for sharing. Yeah,
We also-
I wrestled with those charts, those quality news charts that show Reuters and the New York Times in the middle, and then, you know, InfoWars out here at the fringes. And for a long time I didn't like them. I was like, that's just that's a crutch. Handing a kid a chart like that is a crutch. But then I came to realize my students need that crutch, right? Because they don't have a understanding of the landscape, right? So
those charts are now, I've been taking a series of classes about those charts, and the person who developed them has her own company now where you can get a blank one and do a content analysis of specific news articles. I can share that out, but they've been having a series through one of my vendors.
now, Catherine, that is really cool because it suggests a great pedagogy. Construct your, you know, do research and construct your own chart. I love that. Thanks for sharing.
I just want to say something, if I may. I want to apologize to Glenn and Gerald that I was kicked out. So I'm back here. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to.
Good to see you back.
And thank you. And I just want to share what I shared with Dr. Hobbs, that I've been working for 17 years with adults 65 and up. And actually, by me telling them to come up with more propaganda, and of course I said that they know more than me in propaganda when it comes to propaganda, and I have been learning much more from them than they from me. That's what I said before, so I wanted to share it.
We learn from our students. Thanks for sharing. Who's next? What was an insight that came out of your small group discussion that you'd like to share?
One of the things I'd like to share, I work in China quite a bit, and a huge propaganda campaign is going on clean networks. And during the Trump administration, there's a giant global propaganda war for United States unilateralism versus Chinese multilateralism. And the United States is measurably losing its status in the world. China is trying to gain, and it's hard to make those gains. But when we need to look at propaganda, I think a student experience would be TikTok. TikTok is a Chinese apparatus that in China is really nasty. American TikTok offers resistance, a kind of thumb in your eye to the establishment. And one of the things to think about is how a vehicle offering resistance is itself a form of do-it-yourself propaganda. And TikTok gets its student experiences. There's some questions with how you access students, because not all of it should be accessed by middle school kids, and high school needs to be qualified. But this propaganda war, the China version of the term propaganda, is split between propaganda and publicity, and also how media controls work and surveillance works. Our kids think that we're not subject to surveillance. China has character surveillance, we've got credit surveillance. So surveillance capitalism and surveillance socialism puts kids in a common contemporary situation, not to mention all of us.
So very, very, very true. Tom, you're reminding me about how one of the big ahas for my students recently is exploring the Facebook ad library, right? And getting to see behind the scenes how customized, how totally personalized propaganda is becoming. And I feel like that's something that I think in the years to come, we're going to have to figure out how to teach better, right? Now that most of the propaganda that we get is really highly personalized to us, making it even harder for us to spot.
And with that, studies in deep fakes at Stanford, they're essentially pushing the art. So the old relation between seeing and believing can be totally exploitable.
All right, Tony and Glenn, I'll let you have the last word.
Just to build off that Facebook ad library, if you can have students access the Facebook ad manager where they can actually start to create, you will see so much more detail about how you can target people through the ad manager portal than you do through the ad library portal.
Thank you.
Glenn?
I would just wrap up by saying, we need to reclaim propaganda as a negative word, that propaganda is always bad. That propaganda is about how you are influencing people. And there are many ways to do that, and there are many positive examples of that. But we still need to be able to recognize what the tools are, what the methods are, in order to understand the motivations behind the message.
That was fantastic.
Yeah.
Let's give a round of applause to our presenters today. Thank you so much for being part of this. I'm Renee Hobbs at the Media Education Lab. Come back and join us for another webinar next time. And thanks to our guests. Bye now.
Thanks, Renee.
All right. Thank you. Very nice. Thank you.